When a person comes into the presence of others, those around them typically try to gather information or draw on what they already know. They pay attention to things like social and economic standing, self image, attitude toward others, ability, and reliability. While some of this curiosity may seem purely observational, it usually serves a practical purpose. Learning about someone helps define the situation, allowing others to anticipate what that person expects from them and what they, in turn, can expect. With this understanding, people can adjust their behavior to produce a desired reaction. In these interactions, many sources of information and what might be called signs or cues are available. If the individual is unfamiliar, observers rely on appearance and behavior to make sense of them, often drawing on past experiences with similar people or even applying broad stereotypes. They may also assume that certain types of individuals are likely to be found in particular social environments. Information can come directly from what the person says about themselves, or from documents that confirm their identity or status. If others already know the individual, they often depend on prior knowledge and the assumption that personal traits remain relatively consistent over time to anticipate how that person will act now and in the future. While an individual is physically present with others, there are often only limited opportunities for observers to obtain the clear, definitive information they need to guide their own behavior. Many important details exist outside the immediate interaction or remain hidden within it. For instance, a person's genuine attitudes, beliefs, and emotions cannot be directly observed. Instead, they must be inferred from what the person says or from subtle, seemingly unintentional expressions. Likewise, when someone offers a service or product, there is not always an immediate way to verify its quality in the moment. As a result, others must rely on accepted signs or conventional cues that stand in for direct evidence. In this sense, the individual inevitably communicates something about themselves, whether deliberately or not, through their actions and expressions. At the same time, those around them interpret these signals and form impressions based on what they perceive. A person's ability to shape how others perceive them relies on two distinct forms of expression: what they deliberately communicate and what they unintentionally reveal. The first type includes spoken words or symbolic actions that are consciously used to convey specific meanings shared between the speaker and the audience. This is communication in its most straightforward sense. The second type consists of behaviors or cues that others interpret as revealing something about the individual, even though these actions may not have been intended to communicate that information. Observers often treat these behaviors as indirect evidence of the person's character or state of mind. However, this distinction is not absolute. Individuals can manipulate both forms of expression. They may deliberately mislead through direct statements, which would be considered deception, or they may control their unintended signals, creating false impressions through what could be described as performance or pretense. When communication is understood in both its direct and indirect forms, it becomes clear that a person's behavior in the presence of others carries a kind of promise. Those around them often have to trust what is presented in the moment, responding accordingly while expecting that the true value or outcome of the interaction will only become clear later, after the individual is no longer present. Although people also rely on inference when dealing with the physical world, social interaction is unique because individuals can intentionally shape or influence how others interpret them. As a result, any sense of certainty others feel when forming impressions will vary depending on how much prior knowledge they have. Even so, no amount of previous information can completely remove the need to make assumptions and judgments based on incomplete evidence. Shifting focus to the individual who is being observed, their intentions in an interaction can vary widely. They might want others to admire them, to believe they hold others in high regard, to understand their genuine feelings, or even to remain ambiguous. Their goals could include maintaining smooth interaction, or alternatively, deceiving, avoiding, confusing, provoking, or offending others. Regardless of the specific aim, it is generally in the individual's interest to influence how others behave toward them. This influence is largely achieved by shaping how others define the situation. By presenting themselves in a certain way, the individual can create impressions that encourage others to respond in line with their intentions. In most social encounters, then, people organize their behavior to project an image that serves their purposes. As mentioned earlier, when a person appears before others, their behavior plays a role in shaping how the situation is understood. In some cases, individuals act with clear intention, carefully managing how they present themselves in order to produce a specific reaction from others. At other times, they may still be strategic in their behavior, but not fully aware that they are doing so. There are also situations where people consciously express themselves in certain ways simply because social norms or expectations tied to their role require it, rather than to achieve a particular outcome beyond general approval. In yet other cases, these role-based expectations guide behavior so strongly that individuals present a carefully structured image without consciously intending to do so at all. Meanwhile, those observing the interaction may respond as intended, or they may misinterpret what they see and form conclusions that do not accurately reflect either the individual's intentions or the reality of the situation. Regardless, if others behave as though a certain impression has been communicated, it can be said, practically speaking, that the individual has successfully established that definition of the situation and influenced others to accept it as real. One important feature of how others respond deserves closer attention. Since people tend to present themselves in ways that cast them in a positive light, observers often separate what they see into two categories. On one hand, there are elements the individual can easily control, mainly what they say and deliberately communicate. On the other hand, there are aspects that seem less controlled, such as subtle expressions or behaviors that are unintentionally revealed. Observers frequently treat these less controllable cues as a way to evaluate or verify the more deliberate statements being made. This creates an imbalance in the communication process. The individual is typically aware of only the messages they intentionally convey, while those observing them have access to both the deliberate communication and the unintended signals, using the latter to judge the credibility of the former. When individuals attempt to manage even the seemingly uncontrolled parts of their behavior, it brings communication back into a kind of balance and creates what can be understood as an ongoing information game. In this process, people move through cycles of hiding, revealing, misdirecting, and uncovering information. Because observers often trust what appears to be spontaneous behavior, individuals can benefit from carefully managing these subtle cues. However, observers are not always naive. They may suspect that even these natural expressions are being manipulated and begin looking for signs of control within them, searching for small inconsistencies that escape the individual's efforts. This, in turn, creates another layer of scrutiny, once again shifting the imbalance in communication. Overall, while individuals may try to manage both what they deliberately say and what they unintentionally reveal, observers tend to be more skilled at detecting inconsistencies than individuals are at perfectly controlling their behavior. As a result, even as this back and forth process unfolds, those observing often retain an advantage, and the original imbalance in communication tends to persist. If we recognize that an individual shapes how a situation is understood when they appear before others, we also have to acknowledge that the audience plays an active role as well. Even if they seem passive, their reactions and the ways they respond contribute to defining what is going on. In most interactions, these different interpretations are aligned enough to avoid open conflict. This does not mean that everyone is being completely honest, or that there is genuine agreement based on openly shared feelings. That level of authenticity is more of an ideal than a requirement for everyday social life. Instead, people tend to hold back their true thoughts and present a version of the situation that they believe others will accept, at least temporarily. This creates a kind of surface-level agreement, where individuals mask their personal interests behind statements that reflect widely accepted values. Additionally, there's often an unspoken arrangement in how people define situations. Each person is typically allowed to shape the narrative around matters that are important to them, but not especially significant to others, such as explaining or justifying their past actions. In return, They avoid challenging or interfering with how others frame issues that matter more to them. What emerges from this process is a kind of practical social arrangement, an interactional balance that allows the situation to function smoothly. The participants collectively sustain a shared understanding of what is going on, but this understanding is not necessarily based on genuine agreement about reality. Instead, it reflects a mutual acceptance of whose perspectives or claims will be acknowledged, at least for the time being. There is also a shared interest in preventing open disagreement from disrupting the interaction. This temporary alignment can be described as a working consensus. It's important to note that this kind of agreement is not fixed. It changes depending on the context, meaning that what counts as acceptable or agreed upon in one setting may differ significantly in another. Recognizing that people tend to go along with how others define a situation highlights how important initial information is in social interactions. The impressions an individual has at the outset, whether previously known or quickly gathered, shape how they interpret the situation and guide how they respond to others. From the beginning, a person's self-presentation commits them to a particular identity, making it difficult to shift and claim a different one later on. As the interaction continues, new information may emerge and slightly adjust these early impressions. However, any changes usually need to remain consistent with the initial definitions that were established. In practice, it is much easier for someone to decide how they will present themselves and treat others at the start of an encounter than it is to significantly alter that approach once the interaction is already in progress. Since individuals present a particular version of the situation when they come into contact with others, it's always possible that something will happen that challenges or undermines that presentation. When this occurs, the interaction can break down, becoming awkward or disorganized. The shared assumptions that had been guiding everyone's behavior no longer hold, leaving participants uncertain about how to proceed, because the situation has effectively lost its clear definition. In these moments, the person whose image has been called into question may feel embarrassed or exposed, while others might react with discomfort or even irritation. More broadly, everyone involved can experience a sense of unease or confusion as the normal flow of interaction collapses. This creates a kind of social disorientation, where the usual structure of face-to-face engagement temporarily falls apart. While it's important to recognize that a person's initial definition of a situation helps guide how an interaction unfolds, it's equally important to see that this definition carries a moral dimension. This moral aspect is central to the analysis. Social life operates on the assumption that if someone presents themselves as having certain qualities or a particular social status, they are entitled to be treated in ways that align with those claims. At the same time, there is an expectation that individuals are actually consistent with the identities they present. When someone defines a situation and positions themselves as a certain type of person, they are, in effect, making a moral claim on others, expecting to be recognized and treated accordingly. In doing so, they also give up the ability to claim other identities that do not match their presentation, along with the treatment that would come with them. As a result, their self-presentation not only communicates who they are, but also sets expectations for how others should interpret and respond to that identity. The significance of disruptions in how situations are defined cannot be measured simply by how often they occur, because they would likely happen far more frequently if people did not actively work to prevent them. In everyday interactions, individuals regularly use strategies to avoid awkward or discrediting moments. And when such moments do arise, they rely on corrective measures to manage or repair them. When someone takes steps to protect their own self-presentation, these efforts can be described as defensive practices. When others help preserve that presentation by overlooking mistakes or smoothing over inconsistencies, this is known as protective practices, or tact. Together, these behaviors form a set of techniques that help maintain the impressions individuals create in social settings. It's fairly easy to recognize that without defensive efforts, a person's projected image would quickly fall apart. However, it is less often acknowledged that these impressions also depend heavily on the cooperation of others. Without tact on the part of observers, many social performances would not be able to hold together. Beyond the efforts people make to avoid disruptions, there's also a strong fascination with these moments within social life. Groups often engage in activities, like jokes or games, where minor embarrassments are intentionally created but treated playfully rather than seriously. People also imagine scenarios in which someone is dramatically exposed, or they share stories, whether true, exaggerated, or invented, about situations where social breakdowns happened, nearly happened, or were skillfully managed. These kinds of stories and interactions appear in virtually every group. They serve multiple purposes, providing humor, helping people release social anxieties, and subtly reinforcing norms. By highlighting the risks of embarrassment, they encourage individuals to be cautious in how they present themselves and realistic in the expectations they project to others. To sum up, when individuals come into contact with others, they typically have multiple reasons for trying to influence how the situation is perceived. This work focuses on the common strategies people use to maintain these impressions, as well as the typical conditions and challenges that come with using them. Rather than examining the specific details of what a person is doing or how their actions fit into a larger social system, the emphasis is placed on the dramaturgical task of presenting those actions to others. In this way, the analysis draws on ideas similar to those found in theater, such as performance and presentation. Although the concerns of staging and managing appearances may seem minor at times, they are actually widespread and consistently present across social interactions, making them a useful and important focus for sociological study. Before ending off this video, I want to quickly mention the source used for this video, which was the book The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life by Erving Goffman. If you found any of these ideas interesting, the book goes much deeper into how we present ourselves, how we read others, and how social interactions actually work beneath the surface. I've linked it in the description below if you want to check it out. It's a great read if you're into sociology or just want to better understand everyday interactions. And using that affiliate link also helps support the channel. With that being said, thank you so much for watching.